The doctor never came home. On the evening of May 4th, 1889, a white horse pulled a hired buggy up to an apartment building on the north side of Chicago. A man knocked on a door. He said there had been an accident at the ice house. A workman was badly hurt and needed a physician immediately. The doctor put on his coat, picked up his medical bag, and climbed into the buggy without hesitation. Several neighbors watched him go. The Conklin family, with whom he shared the building, watched the carriage disappear into the evening lamplight. Nobody in that building would ever see Dr. Patrick Henry Cronin alive again. What the neighbors could not have imagined as they watched the buggy roll away was that the injured workman did not exist. The summons was a fabrication. The man sitting beside Cronin was not taking him to a medical emergency. He was taking him to an empty rented cottage less than 2 miles away, where a trap had already been set. The investigation that followed exploded into the largest criminal case in Chicago's history, exposing a conspiracy that ran through a nationwide secret society and a deeply corrupted police department. It sent men to prison for life, while allowing others to walk entirely free who, in the judgment of nearly every observer present, should never have left the courthouse. And at its center was a question powerful men determined could never be answered publicly. Dr. Cronin had been asking where the money went. Now, someone had made sure he would never ask again. When the Conklins reported Cronin missing on the morning of May 5th, they did not simply say that a man had failed to come home. They walked into the Chicago Police Department and told the desk officer exactly what they believed. They named names. Alexander Sullivan, the secret leadership of Clan Noir. They told the officer flat out that their friend had been murdered, and that he had been murdered because he knew too much about missing funds and had refused to stay quiet about it. The case was assigned to Detective Daniel Coughlin. That assignment was no accident. In fact, it mattered enormously to the architects of the murder because Daniel Coughlin belonged to the very shadow world Dr. Cronin had been trying to expose. Coughlin was a loyal member of Camp 20, the Chicago chapter of Clan Noir, and a trusted ally of the men Cronin had spent years publicly accusing. Assigning him to the investigation was not an administrative oversight. It was a solution. Clan Noir was the most powerful Irish nationalist organization in the United States in the second half of the 19th century. Founded in New York in 1867 in the aftermath of the failed Fenian raids into Canada, it was structured from its origins as a secret society. It had initiation rites, coded communications, recognition signals, and an oath of loyalty sworn by every member on pain of death. Its chapters, called camps, existed in every major American city with a substantial Irish immigrant population. The Chicago chapter, Camp 20, was the most important in the country and functioned as the organization's national headquarters. Working-class Irish Americans across the country gave monthly dues to the Klan. Dock workers, factory laborers, railroad men, domestic servants, men and women who had very little to spare, gave what they could in the sincere belief that the money was going toward the political liberation of Ireland from British rule. They trusted the organization completely. That trust was not well placed. At a Chicago convention in 1881, a 5-man executive board was established to administer the Klan's finances. Within a short time, 3 of the 5 had identified that by voting together as a bloc, they could exercise complete and unaccountable control over every dollar that passed through the organization. Those 3 men were Alexander Sullivan, a Chicago lawyer with deep connections in Illinois Democratic Party politics, Michael Boland of Louisville, Kentucky, and Dennis Feely of Rochester, New York. In the private correspondence of Klan members who distrusted them, they were referred to collectively as the Triangle. During the years the Triangle held the treasury, Clan Noir became publicly associated in both the American and British press with what journalists at the time called the Dynamite Campaign, a series of coordinated political strikes across London between 1881 and 1885 that fundamentally fractured the nationalist movement's public support on both sides of the Atlantic. The targets had included London Underground stations, the Tower of London, and the Houses of Parliament themselves. The Triangle denied any connection, but when pressed for a full accounting of the funds administered during those years, they produced nothing. Estimates of the missing money ranged from $100,000 to $250,000, an extraordinary sum in 1889, representing years of sacrifice by working people who had been quietly betrayed. Patrick Cronin had been demanding a full public audit of what he believed was an empty and looted treasury. Cronin had grown up in County Cork, Ireland. Born in the summer of 1846 during the darkest years of the Great Famine, that catastrophic period when a potato blight killed over 1 million Irish people and forced another million from their homes. His family emigrated to Canada while he was still a boy. By his early 20s, he had crossed into the United States and settled in St. Louis, Missouri, where he began working as a porter for a wholesale merchant before his obvious intelligence caught the attention of several prominent local businessmen who helped finance his education. He trained first as a pharmacist, then qualified as a physician at the Missouri Medical College, opened a private practice, and built a reputation in St. Louis's Irish-American community that followed him to Chicago when he relocated in 1882. He was, by every account from people who knew him, a man of genuine warmth and considerable courage. He treated patients who could not pay. He spoke at community gatherings. He had a tenor voice that made him welcome at social occasions across the city. He was constitutionally incapable of staying silent when he believed that people in positions of authority were doing wrong. Those qualities made him admired by thousands of ordinary Klan members and made him dangerous to the men at the top. By the mid-1880s, Cronin had become the most visible spokesman for a large anti-triangle faction inside the organization. He gave speeches. He wrote letters. He demanded formal investigations and made clear in detailed correspondence that he intended to hold the Triangle accountable through whatever means were available to him. The Triangle's response was to accuse him of being a British government informer, a spy planted inside the Klan to destroy it from within. Within the culture of Irish-American nationalism, there was no more devastating charge that could be leveled against a man. It required no evidence to be damaging. It needed only to be repeated by people with authority, loudly, and often enough. In 1885, Camp 20's leadership organized an internal tribunal to formally try Cronin on treason charges. The committee that heard the case was composed entirely of Triangle loyalists. Daniel Coughlin of the Chicago Police Department sat among them. The verdict was guilty. Cronin was expelled. The expulsion failed completely. His reputation among ordinary members was so strong that thousands resigned in protest and formed independent breakaway camps. The organization fractured badly along the fault line Cronin represented. By 1888, both sides recognized that a divided Klan could accomplish nothing and agreed reluctantly to negotiate a truce at a convention in Buffalo, New York. Cronin accepted the truce on a single condition. A formal committee would investigate the Triangle's financial conduct with real authority to compel the production of records. A 6-man committee was formed. Cronin sat on it. The committee voted 4-2 that the charges had not been proven. He refused to accept the outcome. He called it, in exactly those words, a whitewash. During the investigation that followed the murder, witness testimonies revealed that Sullivan had openly remarked to associates that he wished Dr. Cronin could be removed. Cronin himself told his closest friends he was taking everything to the newspapers. All of it, the missing funds, the London campaign, the rigged tribunal, the fraudulent investigation. He was going to publish every detail so the public would understand precisely who had done what and why. That was the moment the planning began in earnest. In the early months of 1889, Patrick O'Sullivan, owner of an ice house in the Lakeview district on Chicago's north side, approached Cronin with a business proposition. For $8 a month, Cronin would serve as company physician for O'Sullivan's workers, responding whenever a man was hurt on the job. Surrounding circumstances suggest Cronin had no particular reason to suspect the offer, and he accepted. Around the same time, in March of 1889, a man identifying himself as Frank Williams approached Jonas and Johanna Carlson, an elderly Swedish couple who owned a small wooden cottage on Ashland Avenue in Lakeview. Williams offered to rent the property, paid 2 months in advance, and took the key. He never moved in. The cottage stood empty. The Carlsons occasionally noticed lamps burning inside late at night, but never saw anyone come or go. Also around the same time, a man giving the name J.B. Simmons visited the furniture store of H. Revell and Company and rented a modest set of pieces along with a large wooden trunk. A Swedish expressman named Martinson was paid to transport everything across the city to the empty Carlson cottage. A rocking chair, a small table, and the trunk were placed in the front room. The shutters were closed. The door was locked. Every element had been carefully calculated. The ice house contract provided a plausible pretext to summon Cronin at any hour without raising suspicion. The cottage provided a private location. The false names and cash payments were designed to prevent anyone from tracing the arrangements back to Camp 20 or the Triangle. On the evening of May 4th, 1889, Cronin climbed into that buggy and was driven to the Carlson cottage. A milk dealer named William Murdy's, making his rounds outside at around 8:30 that evening, noticed a carriage stop in front of the cottage and a man walk up the steps and go inside. He thought nothing of it and continued on his way. Autopsy records later showed that Dr. Cronin had sustained 5 devastating, fatal wounds to the head. After it was done, his body was stripped, wrapped, carried through the streets of Lakeview under cover of darkness, and dropped into a catch basin in the municipal sewer system, where the killers fully expected it would remain undiscovered. They were wrong. On May 22nd, 18 days after Cronin had driven away into the lamplight, Public Works employees investigating a blocked sewer in Lakeview pulled a naked male body from a catch basin. Around the neck was a blood-soaked towel. Beneath it, still in place after everything that had been done to the man who wore it, was a small religious medal. An Agnus Dei, a depiction of the Lamb of God. It was the medal Dr. Patrick Henry Cronin had worn every single day of his adult life. The Conklin family identified the body within hours. Captain Herman Schwetler and Captain Michael Skok of the Chicago Police Department took personal command of the investigation. Skok, who had become nationally prominent through his work on the Haymarket bombing case 3 years earlier, brought the full weight of his department to bear on the case immediately. Within 48 hours of the body's discovery, officers had forced their way into the Carlson cottage on Ashland Avenue. What they found inside resolved any remaining doubt about where the murder had taken place. The rocking chair lay in pieces. Every surface of the front room bore marks consistent with a prolonged and ferocious struggle. Someone had attempted to paint the floor yellow in a clumsy effort to cover the forensic evidence. The work had been done so carelessly that a handprint was still clearly visible on the window blind, and the outline of a stockinged left foot could be traced across the discolored boards. The furniture was traced to H. Revell and Company. The man who had rented it as J.B. Simmons was identified as Pat Cooney, known in Chicago underworld circles as the Fox, a man with deep personal connections to both Daniel Coughlin and Patrick O'Sullivan, and a long history of bitter enmity toward Cronin inside Camp 20. Cooney had already fled the city. The hired buggy with the white horse was traced to Patrick Dinnan's livery stable on North Clark Street, a stable regularly used by Chicago police detectives. Dinnan's records showed that on the evening of May 4th, the carriage had been hired by a man giving the name Smith, sent to the stable directly by Detective Daniel Coughlin. The driver, Dinnan confirmed, was a known associate of Coughlin's named John Coons. The man who had rented the cottage as Frank Williams was identified as Frank Burke, also known as Martin Burke. He was located in Winnipeg, Canada, waiting at a railway station for an eastbound connection. He fought extradition through the Canadian courts for months before being returned to Chicago under guard. By the end of June 1889, Coughlin, O'Sullivan, Coons, and Burke had all been arrested. Alexander Sullivan was taken into custody on the recommendation of the coroner's jury, released on bail of $20,000, and eventually had all charges quietly dismissed for want of direct evidence. He never stood trial. Those who remembered his 1876 acquittal for shooting a man dead in a personal dispute would have recognized the pattern immediately. The trial of the 5 remaining defendants opened on August 26, 1889, and ran for 3.5 months before Judge Samuel P. McConnell. State's Attorney Joel Longenecker and Luther Laughlin Mills led the prosecution. William Forrest, among the most skilled courtroom lawyers in the Midwest, led the defense. The closing arguments alone consumed 14 days of court time. The Carlson family identified Martin Burke as the man who had presented himself as Frank Williams. Martinson identified Burke as the man who had paid him to move the furniture. William Murdy's described what he had seen outside the cottage on the evening of May 4th. John Garrity testified that years before the murder, Coughlin had personally asked him to find someone willing to physically attack Cronin in the street. The jury deliberated for 70 hours. On December 14, 1889, it returned its verdicts. John Beggs was acquitted. John Coons was found guilty of manslaughter. Daniel Coughlin, Patrick O'Sullivan, and Martin Burke were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The convictions did not hold. Coons won a new trial and was acquitted. Coughlin appealed on grounds of juror bias, won a retrial, and was acquitted as well. Only O'Sullivan and Burke remained in the Illinois State Penitentiary. Both died there. Pat Cooney, the Fox, was never found. Coughlin, freed by the courts, later became entangled in a jury bribery scandal involving an Illinois railway company, fled to Honduras before he could face prosecution, and never returned to American soil. Alexander Sullivan practiced law in Chicago until his death in 1913, never charged, never tried, never called to account for anything connected to the death of Patrick Cronin. Nearly 8,000 men walked in Cronin's funeral procession. The Hibernians, the Foresters, the Catholic Benevolent Societies, and the breakaway Klan camps that had formed in his name marched together through the streets of Chicago. A full marching band and several drum corps accompanied them through the city he had made his home. He was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Evanston, Illinois. He was 42 years old. For a time, the case was everywhere, in American newspapers and British parliamentary debates, in courtroom transcripts that ran to thousands of pages and testimony from hundreds of witnesses. And then, as years became decades, the name of Patrick Henry Cronin faded from public memory almost entirely. The men who wanted him silenced wanted, above everything else, to eventually be forgotten. In that particular ambition, they came closer to success than they deserved. But the record survives. The trial transcripts exist. The coroner's findings exist. The testimony of the Carlson family and William Murdy's and Patrick Denon and John Garrity, all of it preserved in the archives of a city that in the autumn and winter of 1889 witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when a powerful and well-connected conspiracy was dragged into open daylight and forced to answer for itself, partially, imperfectly, and incompletely, but into the light nonetheless. A doctor asked where the money went and refused to stop asking when men far more powerful than himself told him to. He was lured from his home on a false pretext, driven through the streets of his own city, and killed in a room that had been prepared specifically for that purpose. The man most responsible for the decision to kill him never spent a single day facing a jury. The medal was still around his neck when they found him in that sewer. He had worn it every day of his adult life, through medical school and private practice, through years of public accusations and rigged tribunals, and 1,000 evenings when staying quiet would have been the easier and safer choice. He kept wearing it. He kept asking the question. Some things survived the people who tried to bury them. The Lamb of God was still there. And now, so is his name.